Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. From the Globe and Mail, this is Machines Like Us. So when we're talking about AI, it might be useful to think about it in two different buckets. In one bucket, you've got the tools that are built entirely around AI. Think about all the chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude 3, all the native AI tools. Understandably, these get a lot of attention. But there's a second bucket too. Technologies that aren't artificial intelligence per se, but that have been turbocharged by the recent advances in AI. And I think it's worth paying attention to these technologies too, because while we don't spend as much time talking about them, they also have the potential to transform our world.
How's it going out there? My name is Bliss, and I'm an engineer at Neuralink. And I'd like to introduce you to the first ever user of the Neuralink device. And I think you're my only telekinetic friend that I have.
Yeah, I think so.
Earlier this year, Elon Musk's company Neuralink successfully installed a brain implant in a 29-year-old quadriplegic man named Noland Arbaugh.
I love playing chess, and so this is one of the things that y'all have enabled me to do. It's all being done with my brain. If y'all can see the cursor moving around the screen, that's all me, y'all. Pretty cool, huh?
So the kind of implant Arbaugh has is pretty cutting edge, and it's still in early stages of clinical trials. But it might not be long before these kinds of brain-computer interfaces are more widely available. And the potential of these technologies is pretty incredible. But, and you've probably already started thinking this, so too are the risks. Law enforcement agencies in the United Arab Emirates have already started using neurotechnology to try and read citizens' minds. And corporations are working on ways to advertise to potential customers in their dreams. What's remarkable is that both of these things appear to be legal, because at the moment, there are no laws explicitly governing this kind of technology. All of which makes Nida Farahani's work incredibly timely. Farahani is a professor of law and philosophy at Duke and the author of The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. Farahani is acutely aware of how these technologies could be abused, how they're already being abused. But she also sees their potential, and she uses some of this technology herself. So she doesn't see this as a black and white issue. The one thing she's adamant about is that we need to start developing laws around this stuff as soon as possible, because it might not be long before governments, employers, and corporations have access to our brains. Nida Farahani, welcome to Machines Like Us.
Delighted to be here. Thanks.
So I have a feeling a lot of people listening to this won't really even know what neurotechnology is, or will have heard it sort of in the popular discourse. How do you define that term?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say to the extent that they've heard it, what they envision is something like what Elon Musk has been describing, which is, cutting a hole in somebody's skull and then putting an implanted device inside their brain. And, it's just for people who are paralyzed or who are unable to communicate in some way. And so they need some technology like that. Whereas I think when I talk about neurotechnology, what I'm really talking about is the move toward everyday sensors put into things like our headphones or our earbuds or our watches that are a lot like the heart rate sensors people are used to. But the difference is that they're tracking brain activity, and not just tracking brain activity, but in many cases enabling people to use their brain and what they're thinking and feeling as the way to interact with other technology.
And it feels like because that spectrum is so broad, it can be really hard looking at it to know what is product hype versus what is real. And how do you look at where the actual state of that is right now? And how do you separate where all the hype around this technology is from what really is possible at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a lot of hype out there. There's a lot of hype about mind reading. There's a lot of misbelief about how powerful the technology is to actually be like direct mind reading of, what we're thinking and feeling. And I'd say, where I am is looking at the claims that products make and trying to separate the kind of fact from fiction, right? Which is, I largely focus on wearable sensors rather than implanted neurotechnology, even though, of course, I keep up with all of the science and everything that's happening there. And of course, what happens in the implanted world, a lot of it ends up translating and impacting and informing what happens in the wearable world. But the wearable world is really, in many ways, just at the beginning. But thanks to the incredible rapid advances in AI, and especially generative AI, the power of these devices is like quickly escalating and sort of exponentially changing.
I want to move on to that conversation. I mean, there's few people who have overhyped products, but also delivered some amazing things, more than Elon Musk. I mean, how do you read the claims they're making around what Neuralink can do and like could do? Like, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, it is pretty wild. So I'll say this, which is having Elon Musk in the field is useful to the field, right? Because it brings a lot of attention and a lot of funding. But the jury is very much still out on Neuralink. I mean, they just published, and by published, I mean, announced on like Twitter and released like a press release that, they just made it recently past 100 days of the first person as part of their clinical trial and showed that some of the threads that are part of their device retracted, that is, moved from where they were originally placed. And they've lost, I think, signal from those. These are implants that have to last a lifetime. And so if 100 days in, you're already seeing that kind of movement, definitely raises alarm bells and says, like, is this going to work? Is it going to be sustainable? Is it enough that there are a whole bunch of other threads and redundancy that's in the brain that will enable it to work anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I find it remarkable that this conversation can go from literally embedding implants in your brain to wearables like EEG headbands that help you focus or meditate. And you've actually written a lot about how you use some of those technologies. Can you tell me about that?
So I am somebody who suffers from chronic migraines. And so I would say I've always been quite interested in what can I do to my brain to make it feel better, right? As a starting place, or what can I do as a chronic migrainer? And, there are periods of time where I've had migraines, almost every single day. Is there a way that I can prevent the migraines from happening and better, see the onset of migraines and be able to modulate them? And so that includes everything from using, FDA-approved stimulation devices, neurostimulation devices, something I'll wear across my forehead, which will give electrical stimulation to try to decrease the pain or try to stop the migraine, to daily use of products that enable me to meditate more effectively, because it turns out that being able to meditate more effectively for me decreases my stress levels, is able to use neurofeedback in many ways that have decreased the amount of drugs that I need to use. And the reason I want to decrease the amount of drugs I need to use is because they have side effects, whereas for me, neurofeedback doesn't have the same side effects. And so I've used these devices for years that enable me to literally see brain activity and then use that as a way to get into a meditative state for longer and more sustained periods of time.
So how does that work? Can you walk through sort of what it means from like, what does that feedback look like? What does the seeing the brainwaves on a screen do?
Yeah. So for some people, you don't need it, right? For some people, they're just very good at meditating and they figure out how to, achieve a meditative state. I'm somebody who does better with feedback where, I'm kind of like, am I doing it right? Is this actually working? Right? I need some data that helps me actually see and understand it. And so being able to know, what do your alpha brainwave activity look like? What does your beta brainwave activity look like? Can you modulate them? And so what that looks like is you put on a headset and, they're not the most comfortable things in the world. They're certainly not the most stylish things in the world. But if you're doing it and, for a half an hour in the privacy of your own home, you don't care that much what you look like, right? So they connect via Bluetooth to an app on your phone. And that app on your phone can either give auditory feedback or just show you, like, if you are kind of in the meditative state, and you can look at the data afterwards or during a session. And they'll do guided feedback. So in the beginning, what I would do a lot is there was auditory feedback where you could have birds chirping when you were in a meditative state. So if you had modulated your alpha and beta brainwave activity such that it correlated with meditative state, the birds would start to chirp. So I've used it for that. I've used it to modulate my migraines. I suffered from really terrible PTSD for years after we lost our daughter. And really nothing worked from kind of traditional talk therapy for me. And eventually I was able to use the combination of kind of talk and exposure therapy and see the kind of stress and anxiety and an emotional reaction I was having when I would recall these memories, and be able to, again, use the techniques of the meditation that I, had been able to do for years and modulate my brain activity down when I would experience those memories. And so that enabled me finally to be able to work through a lot of the worst of the PTSD, to be able to tolerate those memories in a very different way.
Yeah. It feels like a lot of what that's doing is giving us a window into understanding how our brain works.
That's right. Yeah.
With greater fidelity. I mean, we don't have any window into it. And like, what have you learned about your brain through all of this? Do you understand your brain more and
to the extent that there is objective evidence about your brain, right, or at least correlates of objective evidence about your brain, for me, having, some data and how my brain reacts to information has given me insights that my own kind of internal software was faultier about, right? So like my own introspection was not as accurate about when I'm in a meditative state or what I was experiencing at the time that I was suffering from PTSD. And what I would love is more data over time, right? If I could get like early alerts of here's the changes in your brain activity happening, and you have a migraine that's, building up and that you're going to start to experience as pain within a day or two. I would love that early data, right? There's a whole bunch of things that are happening in your brain that you don't even realize is happening. And so I have at least gotten a glimpse, right? A better glimpse about what's happening in my brain activity, but I would love much more.
I want to talk more about the data side of this, because I find this is where it gets incredibly interesting at the moment. But just on the short-term use cases, it does seem like some of the brain-computer interfaces, like we were talking about, the slightly more invasive ones, do just have remarkable potential for addressing a whole range of disabilities. And can you just scope out what the promise is there?
So for people who are suffering from, let's start with just the inability to communicate, right? So whether it's somebody like Stephen Hawking, right, who is suffering from progressive ALS and loses the ability to control certain vocal cords or, kind of other features, being able to communicate again directly from your brain is really extraordinary. And what does that mean? It means being able to type out your thoughts so that you have some capacity to vocalize or to verbalize or to communicate via text or other means. That's the difference between having self-determination to say, this is what I want, right? This is what I need. This is what I want to share and communicate. I think for people who don't suffer the inability to communicate with others, we have a hard time imagining how profound that is, right? Think about Stephen Hawking, who had the most advanced technology available compared to anyone. At the end of his life, he was able to communicate, I think, at 15 words per minute. And, already we're getting to nearly the same capacity of any of us to be able to type or speak verbally out loud, like 140 words per minute through brain-computer interface. And so that's incredible. There was a person the past year who in Switzerland had not been able to walk for years, having suffered a spinal cord injury. And there was a brain-computer interface technology that was developed that bypassed the part of their spinal cord that was damaged and sent the signal from the brain to the rest of the peripheral system. And the person was able to walk again, right? That's incredible. So there's a lot of incredible promise on that side. There's also, Parkinson's, there's depression, there's implanted neurotechnology that's stimulation that, there was a person who was suffering from depression that, described it as terminal, that she was literally at the end of her life. And then using implanted electrodes to sort of serve as like a pacemaker in her brain, she was able to regain the will to live and treat her depression effectively. We could go on and on and on, right? The untreated and, undertreated category of people who could be treated with implanted neurotechnology is really extraordinary.
And on the wearable side, why are companies like Meta and Apple, what did they like? They seem to be the ones sort of driving this sort of device side, wearable side, and what do they see as the promise there?
Yeah, I mean, for companies like Meta and Apple, I think it's twofold, right? On the one hand, there's brain health for all of the rest of us, right? If you think about the fact that there are ECG sensors in Apple Watches now, and that has led to detection and even a recent indication for atrial fibrillation, or the fact that somebody might be suffering from a heart attack, like those insights into heart health are really powerful for people. And to do the same with the brain, right? To give people objective metrics of, here's what your attention looks like, here's what your focus looks like, here's what your stress levels or cognitive load or overload look like, to more complex, right? So the fact that Apple has invested really heavily in heart health studies over time, those same kinds of insights and those same kinds of large-scale studies could be brought to the brain, where we track all kinds of neurological diseases and conditions over time through that. So it's probably one of the biggest untapped markets is everyday brain health. But then also neural interface is a powerful area that they're investing in. And so for Meta, who has the Oculus, and for Apple, who's recently launched the Apple Vision Pro, having a different way for people interacting with these devices, to have it be a more natural and seamless way of interacting with these devices, that is by thinking about up, left, right, down, or thinking about typing or swiping rather than having to use like an awkward joystick or a keyboard or a mouse. They're building these technologies from the ground up with neural interface. And so for them, it's a powerful new way of interacting with technology that co-evolves with us, that is, learns our brain activity and becomes increasingly more powerful over time.
And the power and the learning seems to be one of the main aspects that's evolving really fast here. I mean, even since
very fast.
You wrote your book about this, I kept thinking in the back of my mind, reading it, that like, well, AI is turbocharging
all of it.
Everything you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so how is the drive and the movement of more AI interplaying with these technologies and devices, and how they will evolve?
Yeah. So I have the paperback version of my book. It's coming out this summer, and I have a new chapter in it because I asked the editors and said, look, like, given the power of AI that's putting all this on steroids, it would be really useful to talk about that, right? And to talk about how quickly all of this is happening. So generative AI enables decoding of what's happening in the brain in a much more powerful way, because a lot of language or images, you can, where generative AI is predicting the next token, like if I say open the, you can through predictive text figure out that the most likely next word is door, right? So open the door or open the window. Contextually, you can start to much more rapidly decode what a person is thinking and feeling. And so the power that's bringing to these technologies is the capability of much more powerful and much more precise decoding of brain activity. And then if you have a large language model on device, it co-evolves with you and learns your brain activity, so that every day you use it, you have a decoder on your device that learns your brain activity, learns what the signals mean, and learns, when you're typing or swiping or when you mean to do anything, what that brain activity means for you. And that capability to ship products that have very limited capability but learn and become more powerful over time is one of the things that generative AI enables.
I mean, it also feels like the second we step into the AI conversation, it very quickly becomes a conversation about opening up the data in our brain to private actors. You talk in parallel to all these amazing promises. You talk a lot about concerns here, and I'm wondering how you look at the downside risks of these technologies, but also just of opening up our brains and our most personal data to a wide range of private actors.
Yeah, my book in many ways is a cautionary tale, right? It is designed to help people understand that this is coming, that the huge upside potential that we've been talking about is the reasons why people will move to adopt it, why all of the major companies are really in this battle for your brain. And the question that is the open question is, once we cross that threshold and enter a world of brain transparency, once the final fortress of privacy is breached, what does that look like, right? And if it goes the same way that all of the kind of past products in the digital era have gone, what that looks like is taking our brain data and using it, whether it's by corporate actors to nudge and shape our, behaviors, to create a closed loop where they're serving up advertisements to us and using our brain
spyware,
activity.
you call it, or dream advertising. Like, what are those
Dream advertising.
So what would that be? What's dream like, what are these things?
So, dream advertising is the creepiest probably example in my book, right? So this is, there are a whole bunch of products that both have already launched and will increasingly launch that pick up brain activity while you sleep. Like, people are used to already wearing things like rings that track their sleep activity, and sleep turns out to be incredibly important for our health. And so lots of people, I think, will adopt the capacity to track sleep, especially more precisely with EEG sensors in their ears. And the creepy thing about this is it can pick up not just your sleep, but different levels of dreaming, like lucid dreaming, or when you're most suggestible. That is, like, your conscious brain is basically checked out, right? And you are the most prone to suggestion. And in fact, this has been trialed where people have played soundscapes, like Coors partnered with dream advertisers to play soundscapes to willing volunteers while they were sleeping in their sleep lab to try to incubate in people's brains an association between Coors and mountains and, fresh water flowing, so that you would think, Coors is so refreshing and crisp. And so I imagine, like, there's a world in which if there's no regulations, what happens is, people who are selling these earbuds are also entering into advertising partnerships. And, suddenly you have a in-room listening device that's like Amazon Echo. The brain activity signals from your ears, like, this is the perfect time to start to advertise to Nita because she's started to fall asleep or she's in the most suggestible brain state. And then your Amazon Echo wakes up and it starts to play a soundscape that's an advertisement to you so that you're advertised to while you're sleeping. And if you look at the way personal advertising and targeted advertisement has happened to date, there's virtually no real regulation that exists in that. And so most people are like, oh, well, that's horrible. Nobody would ever do it. And of course, we would say no to that. Well, we have to say no to that. We have to recognize that all of this is now possible.
And of course it's going to be done. I mean, it's like...
Right, of course.
And it's also being used by, you just outlined some much more dystopian, in a way, views of how states are using this. And how do you... So what are governments doing, and where do you see that going?
So one of the things I've tried to help people understand is this technology could be the most empowering or most Orwellian technology we have ever introduced in society. And the choice is literally ours to make. And so I point out a whole lot of examples in the book that are not hypothetical or imagined examples, but real examples of how this technology is already being used. And one of them is by governments to interrogate criminal suspects' brains. And already law enforcement agencies in different parts of the world have brought in criminal suspects, required them to wear EEG headsets, and then shown them images like crime scene details that they shouldn't be aware of, and then interrogated to see whether or not the person like if their brain showed recognition of those different images, and then convicted them based on what their brain data revealed. Or, even more dystopian is there is this sixth domain of warfare. NATO has described it as that, which is cognitive warfare, using weapons that are targeted at the brain. So, that's like the chilling possibility. There are a bunch of, documents that come out of the Chinese military that suggest they're investing heavily in this kind of technology. And you can bet this is, of course, if it is possible, it is an area that governments will be investing in. And unless we have some rights, like in the same way that chemical weapons, there are treaties that ban it, we need some kind of treaties that actually get out ahead of this and say, this is not okay, right? That like seat of human dignity and like selfhood is in the brain. We cannot be targeting, disorienting, and disabling brains.
How much is sort of your personal background in being an Iranian American? And
it makes me suspicious, right?
Is that like part of this?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Right. Look, my entire extended family lives in Iran. My parents are from Iran. I grew up with conversations around the dinner table that I'm sure were very different than the average American, right? I didn't grow up with like, all is well. We should trust the government at all times, and don't worry about
Always
anything.
looking out for your best interests. Can be trusted.
Right. I grew
fully.
up deeply suspicious of everyone. Right, that everyone is listening and censoring. And I've only been to Iran a couple of times, but it was really striking to me that when I went, all of my extended family members were deeply worried at all times about being spied on. And, whether they were in their car or in like dark alley, they were like, no, you can never say anything because, there's listening at all times. That kind of chilling effect of a surveillance state has stayed with me as well. And, thinking about the ultimate surveillance state, which is the ability to listen to what people are thinking, definitely is more animated in my mind than it probably would be in somebody who didn't grow up with that cultural context.
This technology is touching on such core aspects of being human. And it's
right.
not just changing our bodies, it's changing what we imagine ourselves to be or what we think of ourselves. And memories are a big part of that. And I'm wondering if I can see the upside to adjusting memories, but should we be doing that? And how do you think about adjusting those core aspects of what made us who we are?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'd say where I've come out on that is that it's up to the individual to decide. And so on the should we, there is an important aspect of memory and an important societal aspect of memory. And if every time we struggled with something terrible in life, we simply erased those memories, a lot of the human experience would change in ways that would be negative, right? I give the example of like if MLK had erased all of his memories growing up, would we have had MLK who would have led, a revolution and social consciousness? Would we have all of the poetry and creative arts that we have in the world if people never suffered or lived through their suffering? So I don't think like as a matter of course, we should say, every time you face a challenge, you ought to erase the memory. My 9-year-old is, talking with me about her experience of being a third grader and whether that's getting into a fight with a friend or her first heartbreak that we'll encounter in life, right? If I were to simply say to her, like the right answer is like, don't worry about it. We'll just erase it, right? Would she ever grow? Would she ever develop the resilience that she needs? Would she ever develop the strength that she needs? Like for me, if I could go back and, take away losing my child, I would 100% do that, right?
Would you erase the memory of it once it had
No,
happened?
I wouldn't erase the memory. I wouldn't erase the memory. I would just reverse time. I would get my daughter back, right?
Yeah.
But having gone through it, like I can live through anything. If I can live through losing my child, I can live through anything, right? If I can get to the place where I'm like a healthy, functioning adult and able to navigate, like literally, I kind of feel like the universe could throw anything at me at this point and I can survive it. And if I had just erased that memory, right, or erased the experience or erased the years of suffering and struggle that I went through to get to the point where I can say I can survive anything, I wouldn't be able to say that. But, am I grateful for the ability to use neuromodulation to be able to work through it so that I don't suffer from intense PTSD? Absolutely. I was dysfunctional, right? And so there are certain modifications to memory that I think like if it is just too difficult or dysfunctional or unhealthy like PTSD that you should be able to modulate. But I don't think as a matter of course we should just encourage everybody to erase their memories. It should not be like a shortcut and cop out to life because part of life is the struggle of life and part of life is being able to work through that struggle and find, a way to move forward. It's part of what it defines to be human, I think.
Yeah, and it's so striking how much of a gray area there is in the question of should we versus the personal question. And
of should you have the right to, right? There's a difference between like should we
should you
and
have
should
the
you
right
have the right
to, or
to.
should we even have access to some of this stuff? And I think on the PTSD side and the sort of the mental health side, actually it's very clear. But then on the very quickly you get to a conversation of should I be able to, and should it be allowed that I should be allowed to do something more permanent or more, right? And so
right, but that is to say, like, who gets to decide, right? And I ultimately think it's up to the individual to decide, and I think we should have access to it,
okay.
But we should also be given access to other tools, right, and other ways of being able to move through grief and loss and the ordinary experience of being human. So I'm grateful that I had access to technology that would enable me to work through incredibly painful memories. So should I have access to it? Yes, I should. And should, the person I was telling you about who was suffering from such intractable depression that she felt like she was terminal, should she have access to technology that enables her to change her brain? I think the answer has to be yes. But should we universally either require, encourage, or, make it universally accessible so that at home, every time you have a bad day, you just erase the day? Like,
of course
no,
not.
Right? There is a line. So,
clearly lines.
Yes.
And lines are created
Yes.
by law, as you know far, far better than I do. So can we just talk a little bit about what's legal now in this space? I mean, we've talked about a wide range of capacities, both potential and actual. What's legal in this space, just in sort of a Western democratic context?
So it's almost all legal, right? I would say legally, most companies can market products without much prior approval that's required, not for implanted neurotechnology. That goes through a really detailed and very legally regulated space of safety and efficacy testing. But for wearable technology, so long as people aren't making health claims, most regulators treat it as like a wellness or an entertainment product, in which case you can just market it like any other product.
Which is super interesting. The regulatory structure has forced an industry into that space in a way, right? Into the wellness space.
It has, right? They like sort of contort themselves to make the weakest claims possible just to bypass having to do safety and efficacy testing. And most companies can do whatever they want with the data, right? And so if they want to use it, if employers want to use it to monitor employees, which I talk about in my book, and that's happening in a lot of cases, if governments want to use it, whether it's to interrogate the brain or any other purpose, there are virtually no limits on any of these products. And I think, that's, I say, problematic. It's problematic, in that there's no, protections for consumers that would actually ensure that they have access to their own data, or it's problematic that brain data, which is in many ways more sensitive than other kinds of personal data of the past that has been collected, can be used by anyone. It's problematic that employers can use it and use it as a tool of surveillance and disempowerment and further, driving the gap between the power asymmetry that exists between employers and employees. And it's problematic that governments can use it with virtually no constitutional or other protections that would safeguard people from having that happen. So I identify very big legal gaps in the book to say, I'm helping, I hope, to reveal that while there is incredible promise in this space, unless we put the right set of both rights and safeguards in place, we're just as likely to get the really bad oppressive outcome from the technology as we are to get the good and upside potential from it.
And there's clearly sort of a global, international sort of human rights approach to this, or
there is, yeah.
But I keep getting struck reading through all these examples and hearing about them is that much like other digital technologies, there's a propensity to jump to sort of the big global treaty or something, when a lot of this feels like it should be already in law. Just take the employee-employer relationship. If I'm using some sort of wearable device and my employer is surveilling me, clearly there's employment law that comes into play there. Or clearly we should be updating our data privacy laws.
We need to do all of those things at once, right? So one thing that's, a major positive development is that UNESCO has been charged by the 194 member states to develop a global standard around the ethics of neurotechnology. Now, the reason a global instrument like that is useful is you're absolutely right, which is we need employment laws, we need education laws, we need, specific context-specific regulations that follow it. But having some guidance on what that looks like in all of those different contexts can be helpfully framed by an instrument like that says, you need laws that, deal with employment settings. You need specific neural data policy laws. You need, to think about its use in education and what it means for kids. I think 100%. We need to be moving quickly on all of those fronts at once. But happily, that instrument is progressing in ways that I think will give some useful guidance about all of these different context-specific areas.
And do you think we should be thinking about this set of technologies in the sort of regulatory and legal space as fundamentally different than other digital regulations and tools that we're already sort of evolving?
So I've been encouraging kind of thinking about it holistically, right? Which is these technologies don't exist in isolation, but in convergence with other technologies. They do raise some different and unique questions. Like, I do think that data about brain and mental experiences are different than some other kinds of personal data, but you can get that information through eye tracking or through facial emotional recognition or other kinds of biometrics that go well beyond neurotechnology. And so when you're developing regulatory policy, you don't want to say like the data from neurotechnology is specially protected, but all of the rest of the ways of getting access to brain and mental experiences are going to be ignored.
Which does the same thing, could end up at the same place.
Which does the same thing and just encourages companies to focus on, gathering it from those other sources instead, right?
And this all feels, I'm wondering, we're just starting to talk about how to regulate 10-year-old technologies with social media platforms and early data collection tools. So how long do we have here?
Not long. Like a year, right? But I'd say what we
that doesn't strike
what we have
that's I gotta say
it's not long. But the thing is, like, we got it wrong with a lot of the other digital technologies, right? And we're now seeing all of those harms. And so what happens with a technology like this, where people get it, like they understand why you need to regulate this, and they're seeing all of the harms from all these past technologies that require regulation, it allows us to take a more comprehensive view, right? To say, okay, if this is what's coming and this is what has passed, here's what we need to do to actually address all of these at once, not take a whack-a-mole strategy to technology, but instead really say, okay, we see what happened, where it went badly. We see how badly that could go for this technology. Let's now take an approach that's more thoughtful and more holistic.
Just finally here, what's at stake here? And what do we lose when we lose the ability to think freely? And how does that affect us as society and as individuals?
Yeah, I'd say fundamentally what it means to be human is what's at stake, right? The intimacy of human relationships, the capacity to be vulnerable with other people and to choose what you share, the inner landscape that really comes to define your own space of deciding who you are, being able to reflect and understand, rise up against tyranny, be able to, have the capacity to try out any idea or figure out any direction and course you want to take in your life. That's what's at stake, and that's true individually and collectively. So, just basically the most fundamental aspect of human flourishing is what's at stake.
Only that.
Which I say with a tiny, tiny bit of sarcasm, but only that.
Yeah. And I'm really struck by how you're both sort of a critic and a user of these technologies. You balance these sort of two things, an optimistic versus pessimistic view on this in a powerful way. So where do you land on that? Would you give away all the potential to eliminate the risks?
I have to believe in the collective voice of humanity to be able to shape and change technologies in ways that align with human flourishing. And so my goal and hope is that if I help people truly understand what's at stake, both the positive and the negative, that collectively people will mobilize to ensure that the choices we make now secure the future of human flourishing.
And only that is at stake. So thank you for everything you're doing to push this conversation forward and for speaking to me about it.
Thanks so much.
Machines Like Us is produced by Paradigms in collaboration with the Globe and Mail. The show is produced by Mitchell Stewart. Our associate producer is Sequoia Kim. Executive producers are Kathleen Goldhar and James Millward. Our theme song is by Chris Kelly. A special thanks to Matt Frainer and the team at the Globe and Mail. If you liked the interview you just heard, please subscribe or leave a rating or a comment. It really helps us get the show to as many people as possible.